So, Prince William and Catherine just made a monumental decision regarding Queen Camilla's future, one that King Charles absolutely never expected to hear directly from his own son. And when the king finally understood exactly what they were telling him, he completely didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just sat there in absolute, stunned silence, because this absolutely wasn't about a petty squabble over a title, or just another messy family disagreement quietly hidden behind thick palace doors. William and Catherine were forcefully drawing an unshakable boundary around the next reign, and Camilla was left standing squarely on the outside of it. And before that tense meeting finally ended, Charles heard exactly one devastating sentence that made the entire historical Queen Mother model completely collapse around him. Before we dive deep into exactly how this all unfolded, if you want significantly more royal deep dives exactly like this one, hit subscribe to my channel. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps the channel continue this kind of reporting. The highly secretive meeting happened securely at Windsor Castle on Thursday, the 13th of August, 2026, at precisely 6:25 in the evening. Charles had been vaguely told the meeting concerned future transition arrangements. That is exactly the kind of dry, bureaucratic palace phrase that usually simply means boring discussions about staffing levels, future diaries, and administrative continuity. Absolutely nothing explosive. Then he walked into the private sitting room and immediately saw both William and Catherine waiting for him. Sitting squarely on the table between them was a thick, cream-colored folder. Exactly 4 words were printed boldly across the front: the next reign household. Charles sat down slowly and looked intensely from William to Catherine. William didn't open the folder. Catherine did, and that specific, deliberate movement completely changed the entire dynamic of the room immediately. It explicitly told Charles the massive decision absolutely hadn't come from William alone. Catherine wasn't just sitting there as silent, dutiful support. She was a driving, equal part of it. When Charles started nervously reading the very first page, the comfortable, secure future he had quietly assumed for Camilla began to look entirely different. There was absolutely no cruel sentence explicitly saying Camilla would lose her dignity. There was absolutely no aggressive demand that she completely disappear from the family. There was absolutely no petty attack on the validity of her marriage. The legal wording was significantly colder and far more clinical. One sovereign, one working household, one center of royal authority when the next reign begins. It sounded entirely administrative, right up until the massive consequence of those words became crystal clear. If Charles died before Camilla, there would be absolutely no automatic, sprawling second royal court built entirely around his widow. There would be absolutely no inherited massive palace machinery, absolutely no guaranteed highly paid communications office, absolutely no permanent institutional staff retained simply because they had loyally served the previous reign, and absolutely no comfortable assumption that Clarence House would automatically continue to operate as a completely separate, rival royal headquarters. Camilla could certainly remain part of the extended family, and perfectly keep her lawful, legal status. But William and Catherine were making one massive thing completely unmistakable. The immense machinery of the monarchy after Charles died would belong exclusively, entirely, to the next king and queen. That was exactly the devastating announcement Charles absolutely hadn't expected, and the core idea, surprisingly, hadn't even started with William. Exactly 3 days earlier at Kensington Palace, Catherine had been meticulously reading a dense historical briefing on previous royal transitions. Most of it was incredibly routine history, until she explicitly reached the year 1952. King George VI had died at Sandringham. Princess Elizabeth instantly became Queen Elizabeth II. His grieving widow became Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, smoothly moved her massive operation to Clarence House, and incredibly remained one of Britain's absolute most highly visible, powerful royal figures for decades, complete with a massive staff, endless engagements, hundreds of patronages, and an enormous public presence. Catherine read that specific historical section twice. Then she astutely noticed the highly specific phrase that completely changed everything: Queen, Mother, President. She looked directly across the table and pointedly asked her advisors exactly what that historical precedent would mean for Camilla. The answer came incredibly carefully. A surviving queen consort could theoretically continue highly visible public work, legally keep a massive household, retain immense ceremonial visibility, and comfortably remain surrounded by a deeply established, highly loyal network of staff. Catherine listened silently. Then she asked the massive question absolutely nobody in the room seemed eager to answer. Would Camilla have her own, independent household? And the resulting, heavy silence lasted exactly long enough to confirm her fears. Catherine's primary concern absolutely wasn't that Camilla might harmlessly continue some quiet charity work or attend nice family occasions. The massive problem was purely institutional. A household legally means highly paid advisors, aggressive scheduling, a dedicated communications team, massive invitations, high-profile patronages, daily security briefings, and guaranteed access to a prime royal residence from which immense influence can easily continue to flow. Individually, each separate piece looks perfectly harmless. Taken together, they create something infinitely more dangerous. A massive, second center of royal gravity, operating right beside the new, reigning sovereign. That specific reality deeply bothered Catherine, primarily because the successful queen-mother arrangement had only existed inside a completely different, much simpler family structure. Queen Elizabeth, the queen-mother, was the actual, biological mother of the new queen. Camilla, however, would merely be William's stepmother. Catherine herself would be the reigning queen consort. Completely different familial relationships, an entirely different, highly toxic history, and completely different, modern media pressures. Catherine turned directly to William and asked the exact question that finally forced him to completely stop treating the matter as a dry, technical issue. Were they actively planning their own, distinct reign, or were they simply, blindly preparing to inherit massive assumptions lazily made for somebody else entirely? William fiercely resisted the idea at first. He intimately knew exactly what would happen if they dared to actively touch Camilla's future status. People would instantly call it petty revenge. Diana's name would inevitably return to the screaming headlines. Catherine would be aggressively accused of ruthlessly pushing an older, vulnerable queen aside. William would be viciously accused of finally settling a bitter, decades-old score. He wanted absolutely no part of that messy PR nightmare. Then Catherine calmly said something he absolutely hadn't expected. She told him that if the strict rule looked entirely too personal and targeted, he should make it strictly apply to her too. William stared at her in shock. Catherine completely meant it. She explicitly stated that if William died first and young George suddenly became king, she absolutely wouldn't expect George to build a massive, expensive second court entirely around his grieving mother either. Absolutely no separate Catherine household, carrying massive institutional weight directly beside his fragile new reign. Absolutely no automatic, unchecked authority inherited simply from having once been queen consort. She would simply remain his loving mother. She would quietly keep her personal dignity and politely continue championing the specific causes that truly mattered to her. But the immense crown and the sprawling machinery of the monarchy would completely, exclusively belong to George. In that exact moment, the entire argument fundamentally changed. This was absolutely no longer just a targeted strike about Camilla. It was a firm, institutional rule Catherine was entirely willing to permanently impose on her own future. Exactly 3 days later, Charles would read that exact same rule at Windsor Castle and painfully realize that the comfortable future he genuinely thought was completely settled had absolutely never been settled at all. William didn't answer Catherine immediately back at Kensington Palace. The room had gone completely quiet, but the heavy silence was absolutely no longer about Camilla. It was entirely about Catherine. She had just brilliantly removed the absolute easiest, most obvious accusation. If the exact same strict rule would undeniably bind her one day, then William couldn't honestly call it a vindictive punishment specifically designed for exactly one woman. He looked back down at the briefing document. The institutional problem was vastly larger. Royal transitions had long depended exactly as much on vague convention as they did on rigid structure. One reign ended, another began, but people, offices, and habits didn't just vanish overnight. Senior figures remained visible. Staff moved. Patronages seamlessly continued. Residences kept their immense symbolic weight. William deeply understood that maintaining continuity could steady the fragile institution. But he also deeply understood Catherine's stark warning. Continuity could easily mutate into arrogant entitlement if nobody decided exactly where the old reign stopped and the new one truly began. Catherine's proposal was incredibly severe, precisely because it was incredibly clean. A surviving consort would keep their personal dignity, lawful title, family position, and private interests. But actual institutional power would not pass automatically into the next reign. If the new sovereign explicitly wanted that specific person involved, The formal invitation would come directly from the new sovereign. Not from custom, not from assumption, and not simply because a massive household had existed for years and expected to continue forever. That massive distinction entirely changed William's expression. It finally gave him something solid he hadn't had before, an unshakable principle. He asked the advisors to rigorous test the new rule from absolutely every direction. What happened to communication staff? What happened to existing offices? Which patronages were personal and which depended on the crown? Could a former consort continue public appearances without creating massive public confusion about exactly who truly represented the sovereign? Could a royal residence remain closely associated with the previous court without quietly becoming a rival, second headquarters? The answers weren't simple. A massive transition decided hastily during grief would be incredibly vulnerable to emotion, pressure, and rushed promises. A massive transition discussed logically, years in advance, could be solidly built entirely around strict rules rather than messy personalities. William still saw the danger. His mother's name would be pulled into it regardless. Any decision reducing Camilla's future institutional influence could easily be framed as a son settling an old family score. He also knew Catherine would be accused of using her popularity to diminish Camilla before becoming queen herself. Catherine had anticipated it and made the sacrifice explicit. If William died before her and George inherited the crown, she would not expect the machinery of William's reign to remain wrapped around her. She wouldn't demand an independent communications office because the public loved her. She wouldn't insist that staff answer to her because they had done so for years. She wouldn't place George in the position of becoming king while still carrying the institutional weight of his mother's former authority. The thought was undeniably uncomfortable. That was exactly why it worked. William knew what Catherine represented to George. He knew what losing a parent could do to a vulnerable heir, having lived through that exact rupture himself. The idea of reducing Catherine's formal position after his own death didn't feel clinical. It felt incredibly personal. Yet, Catherine was asking him to permanently separate two things the monarchy often blended together: family love and constitutional authority. One could survive without aggressively controlling the other. From that exact point, the legal wording tightened significantly. One reign, one household, one sovereign at the absolute center. The advisors stripped away anything that sounded vindictive. No reference to Camilla by name, no mention of Diana, no language about removal, no suggestion that a surviving queen should be humiliated or hidden. The rigid rule had to be strong enough to fundamentally change the massive structure and entirely neutral enough to survive the accusation that it had been written for exactly one person. Then someone raised the massive question everyone had been circling: Clarence House. The room changed again. A residence could be private. It could also become something else entirely. A place where staff gathered, where guests were received, where charities met, where briefings arrived, where a former queen's public identity continued long after the sovereign beside whom she had served was gone. And Clarence House carried immense history. William didn't answer immediately. Catherine watched him. The advisors waited. The Queen Mother had famously lived there for decades. Charles intimately knew that precedent better than anyone. Camilla already heavily used Clarence House as part of royal life. If William and Catherine were truly serious about one household, they would have to decide whether the principle stopped at staff and offices, or if it reached the residence itself. That was exactly when William understood they couldn't settle this quietly among advisors. Charles absolutely had to hear it directly from them. Not after a leak, not after a headline. A private meeting was arranged at Windsor Castle for Thursday evening. The description sent ahead was incredibly restrained. Future transition arrangements. Charles was given no reason to expect a massive confrontation. William desperately wanted his father to see the pure principle on paper before hearing anyone else's interpretation of it. By the time the folder was prepared, Catherine's initial question had become a massive rule capable of completely reshaping absolutely every reign that followed. But one massive issue remained completely unresolved: Clarence House. And Charles was about to ask exactly about it first. By 6:31 that evening, Charles had reached the end of the first page. He looked up incredibly slowly. The room at Windsor no longer felt like a routine meeting about future arrangements. William sat opposite him with his hands tightly folded. Catherine had the folder open directly in front of her. Charles had read exactly enough to fully understand the direction of the proposal, but not enough to truly accept exactly what it meant. His first reaction wasn't explosive anger. It was profound disbelief. He said, This is entirely about Camilla. William answered incredibly carefully. It affects Camilla. Charles held his gaze intensely. That is the exact same thing. Catherine bravely spoke up before William could even continue. No, it isn't. That firm answer unsettled Charles significantly more than a shouting argument ever would have. He turned slowly back to the paper. A new reign would begin with exactly one sovereign, exactly one central household, and exactly one unbroken chain of institutional authority. A surviving consort could retain personal dignity and family standing, but absolutely no office, absolutely no residence, and absolutely no staff structure would continue by automatic right. Charles stopped abruptly at one specific line. Then he asked the exact question William had fully expected. What exactly happens to Clarence House? Absolutely nobody answered him immediately. That heavy pause carried decades of history. Clarence House wasn't simply another royal address. It had been the London home of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, for almost 50 years after the death of George VI. Charles had grown up intimately with his grandmother, existing as a massive, permanent royal force throughout his mother's entire reign. For Charles, Clarence House was absolute proof that a royal widow could remain incredibly important without challenging the sovereign beside her. To Charles, that historical model was deeply familiar, maybe even highly reassuring. A royal widow didn't vanish simply because her husband's reign ended. She remained present, widely recognized, and surrounded by the machinery that allowed her to continue serving. But William was actively preparing to completely break that specific assumption. He looked directly at his father. Absolutely nothing is automatic. Charles didn't move. William continued, his voice steady. Not the house, not the office, not the staff, not the institutional role. Each sentence landed separately. That was the part Charles hadn't expected. He knew William would one day aggressively shape his own court. What he hadn't expected was an ironclad rule explicitly stating that the previous queen's entire structure could completely end the exact moment the previous king's reign ended. Charles leaned back heavily in his chair for the first time. The conversation became painfully personal. And if I'm absolutely not here to protect her, that single, vulnerable question completely changed the atmosphere. The powerful monarch disappeared for a brief moment. The protective husband remained. William's expression visibly softened slightly, but his firm answer didn't. She won't need protection from us. Charles looked at him incredulously. Then exactly what do you call this? William waited a full second. A boundary. Absolute silence followed. Charles had spent long decades waiting for the heavy crown, and now his own son was aggressively asking him to actively imagine the exact day when that crown had already passed on. He was being brutally forced to clearly picture Camilla, alive and alone, inside a massive monarchy that no longer belonged to their household. Charles turned slowly toward Catherine. Until that moment, William had forcefully carried almost all of the explanation. Charles seemed to expect Catherine to remain politely supportive, but ultimately quiet. Instead, she boldly moved the massive argument somewhere he absolutely hadn't anticipated at all. It applies entirely to me too. Charles stared at her in complete shock. That specific sentence absolutely didn't fit the defensive explanation he had been frantically building in his own mind. Catherine continued firmly. If William tragically died before her and young George suddenly became king, she explicitly stated she would completely accept the exact same principle. She wouldn't expect George to expensively preserve a separate court around his mother simply because she had once been queen. She wouldn't assume William's vast staff should automatically remain hers. She wouldn't demand a permanent, powerful institutional voice existing right beside her son's throne. Charles listened without interrupting. Catherine was actively placing her own entire future squarely inside the rigid rule. That brilliant maneuver made the argument infinitely much harder to dismiss. This was no longer a targeted restriction maliciously created for Camilla alone. It was an absolute limit Catherine was entirely willing to live under herself. Her central point was incredibly simple and powerful. When George eventually became sovereign, his massive reign had to belong entirely, exclusively to him. Not to the heavy memory of his dead father. Absolutely not to the lingering expectations of a previous household. Then Catherine gave Charles the exact line that completely stopped the room. My son should absolutely never have to inherit my authority, as well as his father's crown. Charles looked slowly down at the folder. He didn't answer her. There was absolutely no explosion of anger. Absolutely no dramatic rejection. Absolutely no sudden order ending the meeting. He simply sat back in defeat. Charles could easily disagree with William's cold boundary. He could deeply worry about Camilla. He could strongly question whether proven history should be completely abandoned so quickly. But Catherine had completely removed his absolute easiest, most effective defense. He could no longer truthfully say the rule existed only because of Camilla. So, Catherine had willingly surrendered the exact same massive future privilege herself. For several incredibly long moments, the king said absolutely nothing. William deliberately didn't fill the heavy silence. The massive decision had finally reached the absolute point where Charles could see the next reign incredibly clearly. One king, one queen, one massive household. And Camilla was absolutely no longer guaranteed a powerful court of her own. But the very woman most drastically affected by that decision still hadn't heard it yet. Charles finally lifted his heavy head and made exactly one request. Camilla should hear it directly from them. By 7:05 p.m. she was already on her way to the room. At exactly 7:10 that evening, the heavy door opened, and Camilla entered. She intimately knew immediately that something massive had shifted. Charles was absolutely no longer reading. William sat forward, highly controlled but incredibly tense. Catherine remained perfectly still beside the open folder, one hand resting lightly near the second page. Absolutely nobody offered the easy, fake smile that normally softened an awkward family meeting. Camilla looked first, desperately, at Charles. He didn't explain anything. That silence told her more than enough. William stood up formally and asked her to sit. His tone was incredibly measured, almost entirely formal. It was the exact voice of someone desperately trying to make an incredibly difficult decision sound significantly clearer than it felt. Camilla slowly took the chair directly beside Charles and glanced nervously toward the folder. What exactly has happened? William absolutely didn't begin by discussing her title. He didn't begin by discussing Clarence House. He began entirely with the future. He calmly explained that he and Catherine had definitively decided exactly how their future household would operate. When the next reign, eventually, inevitably began, there would be exactly one sovereign at the absolute center of the massive institution, entirely supported by exactly one principal, working household. Other members of the extended family could certainly remain active, highly respected, and visible. But absolutely no massive second court would continue automatically operating right beside the new king. Camilla's face completely changed. She understood the massive implications significantly faster than William likely expected. Meaning yours, William corrected her, incredibly quietly. Meaning the king's. That specific distinction was highly deliberate. William absolutely wasn't presenting the massive arrangement as a personal victory over her. He was actively trying to separate the mere man from the massive office. Whoever legitimately wore the crown would absolutely control the massive household attached to it. Camilla looked sharply at Catherine, then back to William. And me? The terrified question was significantly shorter than absolutely everything that had come before it. Catherine answered first, her voice steady. You remain family. Camilla held her intense gaze, but not royal. Catherine didn't move an inch. That is absolutely not what was said. William stepped in smoothly before the tense exchange could permanently harden. Camilla's lawful, royal status absolutely wouldn't be erased by a mere change of reign. She could easily continue her personal charitable interests. She could attend all major family occasions. She could appear publicly whenever explicitly invited by the reigning sovereign. Genuine respect absolutely didn't end simply because Charles's reign ended. But the massive, automatic, highly funded machinery definitely would. That was the absolute dividing line. Camilla listened silently, without interrupting, as William clinically described it in highly practical terms. Staff who served the reigning household would answer exclusively to the reigning sovereign. All official communications would come entirely through the new court. Official state representation would depend entirely on the king's explicit invitation. Massive residences actively connected to royal work would be rigorously reviewed, absolutely rather than lazily assumed permanent by historical precedent. So, according to the latest, breathless barrage of royal headlines. But absolutely nothing was being warmly promised, either. And that chilling uncertainty was exactly what Camilla found absolutely hardest to accept. She turned desperately toward Charles. So the exact moment you are gone, I completely disappear? Charles looked heavily at William before answering, but William spoke up first. No, Camilla waited nervously. William calmly explained that completely disappearing and losing automatic institutional authority were absolutely not the same thing. A former queen could certainly remain a respected part of national life, entirely without operating a massive rival court right beside the sovereign. She could be highly present without ever becoming a dangerous second source of official direction. Then, he gently delivered the sentence that brought the entire, massive proposal into sharp focus. Family is absolutely not the same thing as government. Camilla went completely still. For long years, her entire public identity had been meticulously built entirely around visible service beside Charles. Endless engagements, massive patronages, glittering receptions, championing causes, staff briefings, highly visible ceremonial appearances. The massive proposal absolutely didn't erase those difficult years, but it completely refused to legally guarantee that the massive structure supporting them would automatically survive Charles. That was a significantly quieter loss, and perhaps a significantly more difficult one to effectively argue against. Camilla looked intensely again at Catherine. The obvious tension between them absolutely hadn't disappeared, but something subtle in Catherine's calm expression made her hesitate. There was absolutely no smug satisfaction there, absolutely no sense of petty victory. Catherine deeply understood exactly what the massive rule could cost, precisely because she had already willingly placed herself entirely beneath it. She calmly told Camilla that if William died first, and George became king, she absolutely wouldn't ask her young son to expensively preserve a massive, separate Catherine household around her. Absolutely no independent court, absolutely no inherited command over hundreds of staff, absolutely no permanent institutional voice sitting beside George simply because she had once been queen. Camilla's rigid expression changed again. This time, the fierce resistance noticeably weakened. Catherine absolutely wasn't maliciously demanding a massive sacrifice she fully intended to hypocritically avoid herself. That specific fact mattered immensely. The room became significantly quieter. Charles watched his wife intently. William watched his father. Catherine kept her focused attention entirely on Camilla, allowing the massive implication to fully settle without ever trying to soften it. For the very first time since entering the tense room, Camilla completely stopped asking exactly what she would lose. She actually began asking exactly what the rule actually was in practice. Was it strictly written only for widows of kings? Would it equally apply to absolutely every future consort? Could a later, rebellious sovereign simply reverse it? William glanced briefly toward Catherine, then back toward the cream folder. Those were exactly the specific questions they had fully expected, and they had prepared a definitive answer. Camilla genuinely believed she had finally reached the end of the devastating announcement. She absolutely hadn't. William slowly turned the first page over and dramatically revealed a second, hidden sheet beneath it. At the very top was a bold heading Camilla absolutely hadn't seen before, the one court principle. And directly beneath that massive heading was a detailed list of specific names and future situations that made exactly one thing suddenly, terrifyingly clear. This massive rule was significantly bigger than just Camilla or this single reign. The second sheet completely changed the entire scale of the meeting. Camilla had fully expected to find her own name squarely at the center of it as a target. Instead, the sweeping language moved far beyond her completely. The rigid principle would legally apply to absolutely every single surviving consort who came after the reigning sovereign. Catherine was explicitly listed. So was the unknown future spouse of Prince George. Even young Charlotte's future position was explicitly covered if tragic circumstances ever placed the heavy crown on her head. This absolutely wasn't a petty private arrangement designed for one difficult transition. It was a massive, permanent succession rule. The profound meaning was immediate and inescapable. When one reign legally ended, the massive institutional household ended completely with it. The next sovereign could certainly invite a former consort to gracefully continue public duties, retain highly selected patronages, prominently appear at major state events, or actively support specific causes connected to the crown. But absolutely none of those highly visible roles would continue simply because they had comfortably existed before. Absolute authority would have to be explicitly renewed. Camilla read the second page significantly more slowly than the first. That specific detail mattered immensely, because the second sheet completely removed the primary argument she had been aggressively preparing. She could absolutely no longer loudly say the proposal unfairly isolated her. Catherine had already publicly accepted it for herself. Future, unborn consorts would inevitably face it. The massive structure was explicitly designed to far survive the specific people currently sitting in the room. Charles deeply understood that reality, too. The massive question was absolutely no longer whether his beloved wife deserved respect after his reign. The massive question was whether absolutely any former consort should ever carry a massive, independent institution directly into the reign of the next sovereign. And William had actually already asked someone else whose opinion mattered immensely. Days before arriving at Windsor, He had taken the strict principle entirely privately to Princess Anne. Anne had spent her entire, long life operating deep inside the monarchy. She had watched one massive reign end, another chaotically begin, and yet another complex transition slowly take shape. She remembered the Queen Mother absolutely not as a glamorous photograph from history, but as an incredibly powerful, living force operating inside the family. Clarence House had been absolutely full of constant activity. The Queen Mother remained highly visible, incredibly popular, and deeply, dangerously established as a rival power center. William wanted to know directly from Anne whether entirely ending that specific model would dangerously weaken institutional continuity. Anne's blunt response was incredibly brief. Different reign, entirely different family. William gently pushed her once more. Did she fundamentally agree with the core principle? Anne absolutely didn't turn the massive question into a petty judgment on Camilla. That was precisely why her honest answer carried such immense weight. She focused entirely on the survival of the crown. The next king absolutely has to be allowed to truly be king, nothing more. That crucial distinction perfectly protected Anne's point. Personal loyalty to a former queen could certainly remain personal, warm, and highly visible without ever becoming a dangerous second chain of command. Genuine respect could survive, soft influence could survive, massive automatic authority absolutely didn't have to. Absolutely no dramatic speech about old grievances, absolutely no petty attack, absolutely no emotional score settling. Anne clinically treated the massive issue purely as structure. And that clinical view gave William exactly something he desperately needed. The radical idea could survive completely outside the toxic emotions constantly surrounding Camilla. Back at Windsor, William calmly explained that the core principle absolutely wasn't intended to maliciously erase history. It was explicitly intended to prevent old history from becoming an automatic, dangerous command. The Queen Mother model had arguably worked in its specific time. That absolutely didn't mean absolutely every future reign had to dangerously reproduce it. Charles looked intently again at the names listed on the second page. Maybe for the very first time that entire evening, he absolutely wasn't reading it as Camilla's defensive husband. He was actively reading as a sovereign, looking at a massive rule that could permanently shape George and possibly generations beyond him. The room had completely moved far beyond arguing over one residence. It had moved far beyond Clarence House. Now it was entirely about whether the massive monarchy should dangerously carry old centers of authority forward indefinitely, or brutally, cleanly reset completely around the specific person who actually inherited the crown. Inside the quiet room, Camilla had exactly one more question. Could a future king simply reverse the strict principle? William's answer was incredibly careful. A sovereign could absolutely always shape the household of his own reign. That was the entire point. The document absolutely wasn't designed to illegally control George from beyond William's own lifetime. It was explicitly designed to establish a massive expectation that absolutely no previous household possessed an automatic, undeniable claim over the next one. That crucial distinction softened absolutely nothing for Camilla. If anything, it made the sweeping proposal significantly stronger. Camilla could certainly remain important because a future king explicitly chose to include her. She absolutely couldn't aggressively claim importance because ancient precedent forced him to. Charles slowly closed the second page. For several incredibly long seconds, absolutely nobody spoke. Then the intense meeting slowly began to break apart. Camilla rose first. Catherine politely followed. There was absolutely no dramatic, emotional farewell, only the incredibly strained politeness of four people who deeply understood that something fundamental had just been permanently placed on paper. William fully expected his father to officially end the meeting right there. Charles didn't. As Catherine finally reached the heavy door, Charles quietly asked William to stay behind. Camilla turned exactly once, then continued walking out with Catherine. The heavy door closed securely. Father and son were completely alone, and Charles was absolutely no longer interested in asking about Camilla. His very next question was entirely about Catherine. The door clicked closed behind Catherine, and for the very first time that incredibly tense evening, Charles and William were completely alone. There was absolutely no cream folder resting between four people now. Absolutely no top-tier advisors. Absolutely no careful, focus-grouped explanations, specifically built for everyone in the room. Just a tired father looking at his heir across the table, with exactly one massive question left that had absolutely nothing to do with Camilla. Charles pointedly asked whether William had truly, deeply thought about what the exact same strict rule could one day mean for Catherine's future. William answered completely without hesitation, every single day. The immediate reply completely changed the tone yet again. Charles had spent the vast majority of the meeting fiercely worrying about the woman beside him and the terrifying future she might face without his protection. Now, he was aggressively forcing William to vividly imagine the exact same terrifying absence from the complete opposite direction, a massive reign ending tragically early. Young George inheriting the immense burden long before absolutely anyone wanted him to. Catherine still very much alive, still deeply loved by the public, still carrying years of invaluable public service, but suddenly no longer at the absolute center of the massive institution she had actively helped lead. Charles pressed him hard on it. Could William really, truly accept that harsh reality? Could he actually imagine Catherine stepping completely away from the massive machinery of the crown, entirely without deep resentment, and completely without a massive, separate household built around absolutely everything she had once represented? William looked silently toward the heavy door Catherine had just walked through. Then he gave the profound answer Charles absolutely hadn't expected. No, but she is. That was the specific part Charles absolutely couldn't easily dismiss. Catherine absolutely hadn't supported the massive principle because it cost her nothing in the end. She had strongly supported it because she fundamentally believed the next sovereign absolutely had to inherit total freedom right along with the heavy crown. If that sovereign was young George, then absolutely, even his own beloved mother wouldn't be allowed to dangerously become a permanent, second center of royal authority, simply because the British public adored her. Charles sat heavily with that profound realization. The massive argument had initially started with Camilla. It definitively ended with Catherine, and that was exactly why the massive decision firmly held. The following morning, Friday the 14th of August, William and Catherine carefully reviewed the final, binding wording again. The stark language remained completely stripped of all emotion. Absolutely no reference to Diana. Absolutely no petty criticism of Charles. Absolutely no line aimed directly at Camilla. Absolutely nothing that could easily be read by the press as bitter revenge. Just exactly one unyielding principle. The next reign will unequivocally begin with exactly one sovereign, exactly one court, and exactly one working household. William slowly signed first. Then he gently turned the page toward Catherine. She read the damning sentence exactly once more, before calmly adding her name directly beside his. 2 signatures. Exactly one massive decision. Absolutely no celebration followed. There was absolutely no grand victory to joyfully announce to staff, because they both deeply understood that the stark document explicitly described massive losses they might personally endure themselves, and it established a massive future boundary that absolutely neither of them could ever pretend was meant solely for somebody else. The true significance was infinitely larger than the paper itself. For many decades, the British monarchy had comfortably lived with the enduring memory of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, acting as absolute proof that a widowed queen could easily remain one of the absolute most highly visible figures in royal life long after her husband's reign ended. Clarence House had essentially become part of that massive, enduring memory. So had the dangerous idea that institutional continuity could effortlessly stretch across generations. William and Catherine were aggressively choosing something completely different. Camilla could certainly remain Charles's grieving widow. She could certainly remain part of the extended family. She could continue championing causes that genuinely mattered to her and appear exactly where the sovereign explicitly chose to include her. But she absolutely wouldn't, automatically, legally, carry the massive institutional structure of Charles's reign directly into William's. And Catherine had actively, willingly written herself into the exact same uncertain future. That was the crucial detail that completely changed everything. Because if William tragically died first, immense popularity absolutely wouldn't exempt her from the rule. Massive history absolutely wouldn't exempt her. Her incredibly successful years beside the king absolutely wouldn't automatically create a powerful second court beside George. The rigid rule would absolutely still stand. One reign, one sovereign, one household. Charles had originally entered Windsor confidently believing the meeting was simply about staffing arrangements. He left heavily, having clearly seen the absolute monarchy after him. That was exactly why the heavy silence mattered. Absolutely not, because he had humiliatingly lost an argument in a small room, but because for a few agonizing minutes, he had been violently forced to picture a stark future in which his own absolute authority had permanently ended. William's had officially begun, and Camilla's fragile place inside that massive future would depend entirely on the next king, rather than on any empty promises made during his own reign. And that massive, looming question absolutely isn't finished yet, because exactly one major, unresolved detail still sits heavily underneath the entire decision: Clarence House. The massive residence Charles nervously asked about first, and the specific question William deliberately never answered in full. If there is legally only exactly one court, exactly who controls Clarence House when the next reign actually begins? That single explosive answer could definitively decide whether this massive principle merely remains dry words on paper or aggressively becomes the most visible, violent break with the powerful Queen Mother era yet.